This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Nelms, for joining us via Zoom. My name is Gita Viviani. Just to start with a quick introduction. Oh, I forgot the microphone. So I'm just on Zoom and I'm forgetting my other technology. All right, my name is Gita Viviani and I'm the programming librarian here at Brighton Memorial Library. I want to thank you for coming and thank Dr. Nelms for accommodating us at CFB out of town by joining us on the screen. I want to start by thanking the Friends for our book sandwich in theory and for sponsoring the program. And we are accepting donations of materials for our next sale. Please drop them off at the circulation desk, and our next sale will be in February, I believe. Yes. All right. And grab a December program brochure because we do have a concert coming up this month for our Sunday Serenade on Sunday, December 11th at 2 o'clock. The Annie Mitchell Jazz Trio will be back. So we're excited to have them. And we also have a great, let me get their names correct. The Genesee and Ontario Model Engineers Model Train Show on Tuesday, December 27th through Saturday, December 31st. And we'll be taking up most of this room if you're interested. All right, please make sure your cell phones are silent or turned off so we don't disrupt the speaker. And as Dr. Nelms begins his presentation, I'll make sure to get the volume up to a level that everyone can hear. So don't worry about that as we get going. I'll also get the lights. And now to introduce Dr. Nelms. Dr. Shaun Nelms is the superintendent of East, Upper, and Lower Schools in Rochester, New York, a position created through a unique partnership between the New York State Education Department, Rochester City School District, and University of Rochester. As the Educational Partnership Organization Superintendent for East, Nelms has been charged with creating a school reform model that can be replicated in urban settings throughout the United States. In 2018, he was named the first William Shelia Konar Director for the Center for Urban Education Success at the Warner School. In this role, Nelms leads the center's efforts to support the success of K-12 urban schools both locally and nationally through a combination of research, relationship building, and a commitment to pursue and share best practices. He has been a frequent speaker on topics related to the creation of equitable school systems and administrative leadership. He is also an associate professor at the Warner School, where he teaches courses in human resource management, school governance, and leadership in urban schools. He is active in numerous community organizations and has been honored for several awards for his leadership in work in education. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Nelms.
All right, just want to make sure everyone can hear me. All right, so there was like a slight echo or delay, which is fine with me. So if I'm speaking slowly, it's because I'm hearing myself at the same time. Is that all right? I can see. All right, so I want to say, first of all, sorry for not being there in person. I'm at a conference. It's the National Association of Black School Educators here in DC. And I mention that because so much that was written in this book has been discussed here in DC by a number of different speakers and presenters, and not referencing the book directly, but I would say the last three speakers talked about their origins and the struggle their families took between where they are now and how their family started within this American context. One individual this morning was Governor-elect Wes Moore from the state of Maryland, and he's a former military individual and author. And he talked about his grandfather leaving the southern parts of the U.S. and moving back to Jamaica because they had offended the Klan and they knew that something was going to happen to their family eventually. And so the entire family moved back to Jamaica, his grandfather and all his siblings, but his grandfather was the only one to come back. And he said, my grandfather was quite humble and said, he shared the story and says his grandfather said, America would not be any good without him. And so they moved back, and he went on to graduate from Historically Black College University, and then went on to become a minister. And Wes Moore is now the third elected governor of African-American male descent in the history of the U.S. So it was really interesting to hear him tell that story. And late last night at dinner, an older gentleman, I don't want to say his age because I might offend someone in the room, but I was saying a guy much older than me, told his story of how how he had met his grandfather who had just been he was a freed enslaved individual, and his grandmother was an indentured servant. He only met his grandmother. Same story. He at the time he said that, you know, folks in the South all carried guns, and he said the sheriff had taken a shot at him, so he shot back. And he said that night his grandmother, you know, fried chicken, and they got on a train and went straight north, and that's where they settled in the Detroit area. And ironically, my grandfather went through the same thing. He got into an argument with a bunch of white men in Alabama, Tuscaloosa, and the rumors in the town was that he was going to be lynched, and he moved my family during the Great Migration to Buffalo, New York area to work at Bethlehem Steel. So it was just a reminder that this history that is talked about in this book is not being spoken as if these were hundreds of years ago, or that these individuals were relics. Like, we are direct descendants from many of the stories and narratives that were shared in this book. And so it was good to kind of take a pause from that and thinking about today's book talk, and just to say to you all that I think we have to remind ourselves that we are a very, very, very young country, and we can't push through what happened and what continues to happen in this country in an effort to just get past it. Wes Moore said this morning in his talk, I'm gonna look up my notes here. He said, loving your country does not mean lying about it. And I quickly tweeted that, and I just thought about that. And it does not mean that speaking our truth, and whatever that truth is an effort to degrade or denigrate this country. It's an acknowledgement that we have a very long way to go, and there are people who are harmed and hurt and are still traumatized by those issues, who still walk and live among us. And I honestly think that's where we're stuck. That we don't want to be honest about how this country has formed, and under the structures and systems that allow some individuals to advance because of those restrictive covenants, and because of lack of access to medical care, and the list goes on and on and on. And so I think we have to come to a place in which we can have these, you know, fact-based, thoughtful conversations without assigning any emotion to the people in the room, if that makes sense. So when we talk about racism or sexism or xenophobia, whatever those things are, people have two choices in those moments. They either accept that they're ignorant and say, I want to be on a continuum of learning to become less ignorant, or they double down in their ignorance and defend what they know, what they think is true. And I think you're all in this room because you're on the accepting that we have to get better and smarter about some things. And that doesn't mean that you will ever become completely competent about anyone's lived experience. I mean, I am not completely competent about the lived experience of Black folks. I'm just one person, so I can't speak for all Black people. I can't speak for the experiences my grandfather had in the South. I can tell his story, but I don't know how that actually made him feel and the fear that he felt. And nor can he represent my story. So I think this book did a really good job of contextualizing different experiences in history in ways that allowed us to kind of dig deep into that particular chapter without losing the thread and the theme of the text. And there were many parts of this text that I thought were engaging and kind of sparked me thinking. One of the quotes in the book, he says, you know, often we forget about the totality of individuals who went through this enslaved or this, you know, this time in history where there was so much segregation and hate and fear. when we start to tell the story of the single heroic figures like a Frederick Douglass and things like that. Like I love when he focused on that. And it was a brief part of the book, but I do think that happens. And I think when we do that, you start to see and hear things like we heard the last couple of years in certain types of media platforms and from certain types of political parties, where they would, the whole bootstrapping idea, well, my grandfather made it, so your grandfather should have made it too. I even heard people say, well, segregation was, 50 years ago. It's time to get over that. Oh, it was only water fountains. Aren't we past that yet? And I think there is an acknowledgement that people will cling on to some quotes from Dr. King even and use those quotes to justify the hate in this country, to say, hey, see, even Dr. King would have said, without them acknowledging that Dr. King was one of the most hated individuals at the time of his death, because he was starting to push for economic equality and to break some of the barriers that were leading to generational poverty as opposed to generational wealth. But people don't want to tell that entire story. So I found this book to be refreshing. I could be honest with you, the stories that were told were stories that I grew up knowing and living and experiencing. So it wasn't new content for me. I will also be honest and say that I was reluctant to want to read the book. And to talk about it, because I'm kind of talked out about the topic. And I'm just to be completely transparent, there was a moment when I was talking to my secretary and I said, I don't want to read another book about the negative experiences of Black folks in America, because I've heard that story since I was a youth. And I walked away, a little like, but I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it and honor Rachel, and I'm going to do it because this is a great group. And I think we have to lean in and even push to our own desire to sometimes to detach, to bring people along. But as I read the book, I was reminded that that by the author, that this is not a story of that was centered in a negative experience. I thought this book was written and kind of centered in a learning experience from things of the past. I mean, even the part of the book where they were at the, I think it was a Confederate graveyard, and they were having the tours, and he was asking, very, direct questions about people coming there and what did they get from it. And I believe in that chapter, he was trying to really see it through the eyes of someone else. Even though that history was hurtful and painful, even though the way it was being presented to an extent erased the pain of people who represented his lineage, I think he was trying to understand the thoughts of individuals in that space enough to be able to give some space and grace to the situation without having such a permanent judgment about individuals who attend those type of events. So from that chapter, I learned, again, the importance of speaking, your truth, not the truth in situations, and giving people an ability to articulate how they were raised to believe certain things in certain ways, even if it goes against everything that's at your core. And when I remember I was reading that part of the book, I was just leaving a coffee shop, and I got in my car, and I was this happened to all of us probably, driving on the street, and right in front of me, I'm going to swear a little bit, so I'm reading a bumper sticker here. It was like, fuck you, Cuomo. And then like the next car was Trump's an asshole or something. And I was just driving, and I sat there and I said, like, what would cause someone to permanently place something on their personal property, like a car or in their front lawn, that is so vile and disrespectful for someone they don't even know? And I kept thinking to myself, what type of hate must you have in your heart that you would really deface? And I guess in this case, they probably were decorating, but you would deface something of value to send a message like that. Like I am completely fine with, Back the Blue, even though I have some issues with how that started. I am fine with, but when you start to put like F you here, or this person's an asshole, or I saw one about, it was something a really denigrating one about women, and I'm just writing down, this is writing down 104, and I'm just watching kind of America move past me. And I'm thinking about all these folks who have really just doubled down in their ignorance. So much so that they feel comfortable offending anyone behind them for miles and miles daily. It just made me pause to say, like, how far do we really have to go to get to a place where perhaps Germany is right now, by acknowledging that there was a dark past, yet focused on healing. Not that they don't have issues, but there's acknowledgement that these people and these stories exist, and that the impacts of these stories and situations may impact how they navigate in the world, the social spaces that they're in. And I just hope that we can get to that place. And perhaps we can't fix all the US, but we have to ask ourselves, to what extent are we doing this for Monroe County? And what is our role in perpetuating some of the negativity and stereotypes that we see, within our own county, within our own living situation? So again, I think this book for me started as something that I did not want to do, but I wanted to honor Rachel because I didn't want to talk to a bunch of white folks about race. And I say that with like all sincerity. Like I really was like, I don't want to do this anymore. Like it's not as if these racial issues for us are just beginning. Like this is something we've lived with and stories that we're told, and it's not like a story you're told like at a specific event. It's like every event, our grandparents would come out, with these stories and tell us in an effort to be careful, make sure, my father made us memorize our New York State license when we got it. Like we got our license, part of getting it was to memorize the 9 digits, which I still know to this day. Memorize the 9 digits of your license, because just in case you get pulled over, you don't have your license, you want to be able to identify yourself to the police officers. And I didn't think much about it then, but as a history major, that was very similar to what enslaved or free individuals would do with the Black codes in the slave acts, when these slave hunters were looking for people in the North. Make sure you had your paperwork. And without even thinking about it, as a child, our parents were passing down the same type of restrictive advice because that was all they knew. I refuse to have my kids memorize their ID number. It's just something I just won't do. None of my white friends have ever, I said that to them, they look at me like I'm crazy. Why would you ever have to memorize, 9 digits to verify that you are one of the good ones? So I think, my orientation to this book was somewhat, I judged it. It was negative. I didn't want to do it. And then I read it and it was more liberating. And now we're at the point in the discussion where I want to have us talk about how you responded to the book. What parts of the book stood out most to you? If we had planned this, I would have told you to come with 2 lines from the book that were just pithy and that just stuck in your head, like a couple of lines that I shared with you all, because there were parts of this book that were transformative for me and allowed me to lean in to this discussion. Because if this was a book about learning, it wasn't a book about, it was not a book about retelling the same story over and over again by a different author. And so I appreciated, reading the text, and I appreciated you all challenging me to do that, because honestly, I probably would not have read it just from the title alone. And so that's the beauty of learning from and with individuals. You get pushed and challenged in ways that are unexpected. So those were I have a bunch of other notes I can talk through, but those are my initial reactions to the text. But I think it would be equally beneficial for me to hear from you all what you took from the book, what was your new learning, and more importantly, what do you plan to do next as a result of it?
Can I have one of the BSI committee members pass the mic around, because then I'm going to...
Yeah, that's much better, because I can't really hear you. You're very muffled. Yep.
Anyone want to share their first thoughts? yourself a book. Dr. Nelms?
Yes.
Thank you for being here. It's exciting to hear you. I know you have been involved in the curriculum writing, the anti-racist curriculum writing on the East Side, which I believe is used here in our 11th grade history classes here in Brighton.
Great.
And I know there's a lot of information that is not in the K-12 curriculum. And I wonder if you or your writers out of East Side are doing, see a place for this information in the K-12 curriculum, and where you would put it, and how you would do that, or where you think it's most important.
Absolutely. So, so it's interesting. I'm going to put in the chat, and I'll say it out loud as well. But since it's recorded, I'll put in the chat. So there's a website. So it's a couple curriculum projects in the community that's happening right now. We're directly or indirectly involved in all of them. We meaning the University of Rochester's Center for Urban Education Success. So there's one that is focused at the elementary level with Shane Wiegand, who you may have heard from before. He and his team are doing a lot of work in elementary setting. They're now moving to the secondary setting as well. Secondary meaning grades 6 through 12, elementary meaning K through 5, PK through 5. They do a lot of work around like redlining and restrictive covenants, et cetera. We have done, U of R has done a project involving some of the Monroe County schools. All the Monroe County schools were invited. Let me start there. But some have leaned in more than others, where we're looking at a couple of thematic approaches to understanding Rochester's history, what led up to 1964's uprising, to bookmark with the death of Daniel Prude and then beyond. So kind of like two bookmarks there. What led to people to have to want to uprise, what happened since then, and then where do we go after the Daniel Prude, his death. And so that has been, that's been really good work. I will tell you that my greatest fear when we started that is that some districts would lean in when equity and diversity was a hot topic and it was one that had a political pressure point. And my fear would be the moment that those things settle, they would step away from the project. And I have no way of determining or deciphering. I have an inkling, but I have no way of forcing that among students and their families and teachers. And so I hope that, the superintendents and our colleagues across the county are using those curricular modules, because it really was things like the power of words. So if you call something an uprising, or you call something a riot, or you call something a protest, you call something a social demonstration, what does that really mean? Like, and what connotation is associated with each of those words? Ironically, when these units were being released, January 6th occurred. And you can just think about how that was portrayed on different media outlets and how it's still talked about by certain pundits in terms of was that truly a riot, or was it a peaceful protest? You can see the exact same incident, right? And people interpreting it completely different ways based on if they want to double down their ignorance, or if they want to say, let me think about this through an objective point of view. And perhaps we're losing some of our objectivity in America. But I would say that that would be a unit that kids would engage in. And it doesn't have to be around racial lines. Those are skill sets that kids can apply to any context. And, the fact that some of the examples we got were involved race, there were some districts and teachers in those districts that were very uncomfortable teaching those units. I know that for a fact because my son came home one day in his former school and was talking about this unit about race and protests. Now, this is when we were piloting the units, and the agreement was that any district that piloted had to go through training. And I knew that his district at the time had not gone through the training. But my son was talking about it. So can you bring that paperwork home that you're talking about, son? He brings it home as one of the units that we created. And the reason why it was so triggering to him is because he had been in the protest with me downtown several nights. And because I wanted him to understand what social action looks like. And I wanted him to be a part of it. And his teacher was like arguing with him in class saying, nope, it was a protest. It was a riot. They were burning buildings. And he said, my dad was down there for 5 days with me and there was no burning buildings. It may have happened one of those nights or two of those nights, but the overall situation was not like that. Oh, you don't know. He goes, look, I can show you my phone. And the more that he like defended his point of view as a eighth grader, the more upset his teacher became. And then she quickly shared her own political views. Well, my family are full of law enforcement officers, and what's happening to them is wrong in America. And I said, that teacher will never be able to have that type of conversation if they're not willing to be a facilitator of knowledge, as opposed to an individual who is going to force their knowledge upon them. And so, even with the best efforts around this curriculum, you have to ask yourself, to what extent are teachers ready and able to do this work? At the same time, it's unfair that students have to wait for that to occur. And so how do we supplement and some of those learning opportunities as we prepare and get teachers ready to do it more formally in the classroom? So, I'm looking at community organizations like your own, like how are you bringing in nieces and nephews and neighbors and cousins into these conversations, regardless of whether or not Brighton does it or not. And I know Kevin is, but regardless of if he's not doing it, like what's the responsibility of the community to make sure that this is a standard, that it is reflected in Board of Education decisions, that it is demanded upon in their curriculum. I say often that curriculum is the moral contract with your community, because what you choose to put in it or not put in it is a very thoughtful choice. It's a thoughtful decision. You have to take things out of history, right? So if this is our American history and you choose not to put something in, that means you're intentionally taking it out. And I would have to imagine that anyone teaching history or English, what they choose to put in front of our students is thoughtful and intentional. And so we have to call the question, like, why is that? So much so, I don't know if you know this or not, but the state is doing a survey of all school districts to see if the Holocaust is being taught in schools, because there were some schools that were not teaching it. And I have two responses to that. It should be taught in U.S. history. It should be taught in world history because it was a world history event, right? I mean, that's what I taught history in 7th grade. So I taught you. I don't know how you can teach about the war, World War II, without talking about it, right? I don't know how you can do that. So then I asked the second question to the state. I said, why is the Holocaust, why has the Holocaust risen to a point where we have to ensure it's happening in every school system, but all the other issues that happen in the U.S. history, like with U.S. history based, doesn't have that same level of demand? If it's from the Native American Removal Act, if you're talking about Reconstruction, you're talking about enslavement of individuals, like how can we demand that in our state for one group from a world history event, even though it impacts people in America today? I'm not dismissing that. But if we're truly going to look at our U.S. system, I think we have to get our own shit right before we start to demand that all the rest of the world's issues are mandated, or do both. It doesn't have to be an or situation, but you definitely shouldn't be an or at the expense of what happens what has happened in U.S. history. Lastly, I would say in that chat is the Elevated Educator site. So when East was creating its own curriculum for our students, grades 6-12, we were out presenting this work, and people in other districts kept asking us, how do I get a hold of curriculum that is diverse in nature, that's inclusive, and we don't know where to start. It was a very honest starting point for individuals. So we pulled a bunch of units that our teachers made, and it's not an all-inclusive platform, but some examples so that teachers in other spaces can start to think about how they can tweak their curricular lens in a way that becomes inclusive. And that doesn't mean only if you have Black and brown kids in your school system. That should be the benefit of everyone, because once again, it's U.S. history. It's not U.S. history for Black and brown folks. And so an example of that might be our music department chose to feature all Black composers for their winter holiday concert, right? And they taught the kids who the composers were, the time in which they, wrote the pieces, some of the barriers they may have faced, particularly those who weren't allowed to go to formal schools for education. They even were thoughtful about not changing how the songs were written. So instead of saying over there, O-E-R, historically teachers would tell them, oh, that means over, so just say over. And now they're like, no, they wrote it this way intentionally because it signaled a time period when the words were pronounced that way. And it also signaled some of the lack of education from those who are singing those songs. So having that conversation before a concert and then having the concert happen, that's a way of showing culturally responsive education. It doesn't have to be about racism. It has to be about making sure that it's an inclusive setting where all cultures are acknowledged and understood by students. What they do with that later on in life is up to them. But I think that's our responsibility to at least expose kids in all settings, particularly about U.S. history. So that's a long answer, but I just wanted to tell you that there's a lot that's happening within the community, if it's at the elementary level or if it's in the middle, with the units that we created with Monroe County Schools, or if it's some of the lessons that we were making available for folks all over the country. But it's there, but to the extent that it's being implemented by teachers who are culturally relevant and understanding, that's a question I can't answer. And it's something that I hope every superintendent and school board, quite frankly, is pushing to ensure it happens. Thanks for the question.
Does anyone else have a comment or a question? I have one if nobody else does. Sure. Just so everyone can hear.
This is Dina, Dr. Nelms. I'm curious from a librarian point of view and someone who purchases books and materials and is a member of the BSI committee. You were initially like, okay, I've kind of read this book before, I don't want to read it again, but what books do you think we do need? Or what, if you had the time, or maybe you are writing a book, or what would your book be about? Anything, it doesn't have to be race topics, anything, but just history or, something along those lines. What books do you think would fill some gaps that currently are in the market?
Thank you. That's a good question. So I got a couple. I didn't expect that answer, but that question. But I've been reading there, and sometimes just audiobooks, right? And so like I'm in DC and I have a book in my ear all the time, or music. But there's a couple books that I read in college that didn't make sense to me that make a lot more sense to me now. And so I'll start with those. One is The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. That book is phenomenal because it talks about the mindset of people who are living in oppressed societies and how they have to be, almost lack of a better term, reprogrammed to understand the oppression that they're in before they can actually get out of it. So it was like this liberatory construct for how one or a society must think differently about their place in it to be able to help change it. And what I like about that book is it made me think, like, to what extent does people who benefit from those who are oppressed develop the same type of mindset that that is something wrong with them because we're all benefiting from it. I was listening to Eddie Glaude, G-A-L-U-D-E. I love his books too, if you want to read any of his books. He did a really good book with James Baldwin. I look for it on my phone real quick. But he said when Trump was elected, he sat at the perfect intersection of racism and greed. And he said, because those who were willing to benefit from his financial policies could ignore some of his racist rhetoric because they benefited from it. And for those who had no benefit from his financial and fiscal policies, yet believed in his racist rhetoric, benefited from him. So he sat at the epicenter of that, and he played both sides really, really well. It's why you see people supporting his policies that don't benefit from them, because he played the other end of that spectrum. So he that just hit him talking to that. I was listening. I was at a conference once he was speaking, and I just walked away. I wrote that down a million times. Like, this makes sense to me. Like, because I couldn't figure out how some of my more intelligent friends were like defending the rhetoric, and I'm like, that doesn't even like mirror who I thought you were. And I don't talk about like the Republican Party as a party. So I think I have some views that are more liberal, some that are more conservative, and some that are moderate. So I'm not talking about the party itself, but the individual within that party, why they swore such allegiance to him and not the party, was so interesting to me. And it's something that was telling for me, as an American, is how people can cling to how they visualize a person, even if that person doesn't hold their same values. And I just thought that was very interesting. But so Pedagogy of the Oppressed is a book I would definitely recommend. I was a history teacher, so my kids have always scoffed at family trips because we got to go somewhere and do something historical. We're going to Puerto Rico in December. And so the book I'm making them read is called The War Against All Puerto Ricans by Nelson Dennis, with one N, Denis. Very good book. It's a little bit about like the colonialism in Puerto Rico by some former politicians and how they took over the domino sugar industry and the railroads and how they essentially created an indentured servant, a system over there. I thought that was a really good book that I've read recently. I love Souls of Black Folk. That's an incredible book that I would recommend reading. It really talks about the struggle for Black identity and Black existence in America historically. That's a really good book. I'm a James Baldwin fanatic, so anything that he writes I like. But he's I think because I love his writing because he's talking about the intersectionality of being gay, being a male, being Black, being someone with poverty, and then having a sense of intelligence that he was trying to navigate in this complex world. From a historical standpoint, I think the book about Abraham Lincoln called Team of Rivals is really good, because it was just an opportunity to see how he had to navigate different people who had separate agendas to try to create something that was impactful for America, for all Americans. I thought that was pretty interesting. I'll give you a couple more, then I'll be quiet. I think you all read Cast already by Isabella Wilkerson. I think that was one of the books on your list in the past. But I'll add another one. I Came as a Shadow, and that's by former Georgetown coach John Thompson. It's him talking about, what I loved about it is that he brought authenticity to that college in a way that people didn't expect. And he was much more of a father figure than he was a coach, but he was a great coach also. And the fights that he had to endure trying to be an authentic person within that community, and how sometimes that offended people within the Black race and people who racialized as Black rather, and how that also offended people outside of that space. I thought it was a really, really, really good, a really good book. And then I'm looking for the one with Eddie Glaude, but the other book is by Eddie Glaude, and it was essentially a book of him almost talking to James Baldwin about how what he was writing about many years ago still manifests today. And I think that's one of the books too that I would recommend.
Thank you. Good list.
Yep.
People taking notes and writing down here the titles. Does anyone else have a question or comment? We have time for a couple more. Okay, Betsy.
This isn't particularly important in the context of the book, but I was very interested in two things about the book. First, the ability of the author to look at things evenly and not get overly emotional about things, and it made me read it the same way. But also, the one chapter about New York City, I will tell you, I had none of that in any of my education, even though I grew up in New Jersey, So I wonder whether you might comment on that. Was that something that you knew about all the time, or is it something, I want to know how ignorant I am.
Yeah, so I'm from Buffalo, New York originally. So I would say that, my experience might be a little bit different than his in that space. But yeah, I mean, those are things I learned about later on as an adult. Even, I'm in DC right now, and there are tours that highlight the African or enslaved architecture that built Washington, DC. I mean, I think you all know, like, the White House was built by the slaves, and most of the government buildings in DC has. There's walking tours that walk around, there's like hidden messages on certain parts of architecture where the enslaved were marking that it was their work without it being seen to the folks who were forcing them to build these spaces, and showing some of the some of the, it was designs that were reminiscent of Africa on some of the buildings. If you look at the African American Museum here in DC, if you haven't been, I would definitely encourage you to go. You know, it's built in a very, for those who've been there, it's kind of it's a unique structure, and it represents on the top floor. To show you what it is, it's like the top of a staff. And so they kind of created it, and it's also reminiscent of a headdress that you would see in some African villages. And so there's so many like very nuanced things that remind you that these folks still walk and live among us without even realizing it. If you get a chance to watch on Netflix, High on the Hog, it's been on a couple of years now. It's a really good show. It was, I think, a 4-part series about the evolution of food in America, as from the African influence to now. So it starts, the first episode was in Benin, and it's walking the audience through the foods that were eaten there, but also how some of those things like yams and potatoes became, and rice became part of the staple in South Carolina, where a lot of the enslaved folks were first landed. And it talks about the Gullah culture there. But there is a segment there about New York. That's why I'm bringing this up. There was one of the episodes talks about the culinary scene in New York. And I didn't know about this, but how it was dominated, the oyster industry was dominated by freed Black folks back in the day. And no idea, but it makes sense if you think about where, how the forced migration to America happened, where people landed and how they migrated. And talked about some of the seasonings that you have and some of the things that we do naturally. Like he at one point in the show, I'm getting a little bit chills thinking about this. He put the hot soup on the guy's hand. That guy turned his hand over and he ate it. And he goes, "Why did you do that?" And he goes, "I don't know. I was always learning that way." And he talked about how that was how things were done in Africa and how those things were passed down. I was in Kenya a few years ago, and I was traveling one of the countrysides, and I was watching women sweep their front porch, the front stoop of their porch. And I swear, like my grandma would do that. Both grandmas would do that growing up. And I always understood, like, why are you like sweeping the sidewalk? Like they would always sweep the sidewalk, sweep the front steps. But it was the exact same thing that I saw in Kenya. And there was a spiritual aspect to it around sweeping away the evil spirits and kind of starting the day new. But to see my grandma do that, I just thought she did it. But to go to Africa and see the exact same thing, like those things are passed down. And so there are so many reminders that we have to preserve, like many other cultures do. They have to preserve that rich culture and history, because nothing is new under the sun. You know, I'll be fully transparent too. So when I'm in my space with my friends and we're talking about how to create, generational wealth among people of color and how to kind of reset this oppressive mindset that we have been forced to endure, I often talk about the Jewish community, because I was in Israel with the Farish Foundation once, and I was just amazed at a couple of things. One is, this is probably funny, how long lunch took. Right? So if you've ever been to Israel, lunch is like a 3-hour deal, it feels, right? Like nobody's rushing. And you sit and you eat and you enjoy the moment of like togetherness and reflection. And then I learned about, Shabbat and on Fridays, and how communities, like even in Brighton, how, it forces people to live in similar spaces, because you're going to walk to each other's homes and you're going to have social events, and you can do those things just by the forced nature of not being able to drive somewhere, forces communities to come together into fellowship. And so I would often talk about growing up in our community, everybody had front porches. We had the exact same, environment where everyone kind of gathered in the front and people kind of spoke. And now we live in suburbs where all the porches are on the back of the house, where you don't even have to engage with anyone. Like we really have kind of changed the social dynamics of where we live, how we engage where we live, and to what extent are we forced to engage with others. So if you think about the Jewish community from Friday through Saturday, it's really an opportunity for everyone to pause by choice, or by religious force, I guess I would want to call it religious choice. But it forces you to to really engage with people authentically and to create a sense of community, for kids to fellowship with one another and productively, to conversations that might come up in terms of, hey, I'm going to attend this college. Yeah, my nephew went there. Just so many natural things that happen when people fellowship together. And what I talk about among my friends is the Black and brown community has somehow lost that. And some of that is due to a myriad of issues internally within their culture, but also things that structures have forced things to occur, even how we divide wealth among people within those communities in terms of, if you're poor, you live here, if you're wealthy, you live here. My understanding from what my Jewish friends tell me is that, it's, my daughter lived in New York City, in Brooklyn. And so she would be like that, you don't understand, if you're rich or poor, if you're in middle class, these folks still, they still fellowship with one another. And although there is classism in terms of how much wealth you have or not, the fellowship is what the common bond is. And so, I think about this, going back to this book and some of the examples. It seems as if when people were living in captivity, there was, because of the conditions they were forced to live in, there was a greater sense of self and purpose in those spaces. And I'm not arguing we go back to enslavement, but I'm saying, I argue that we go back to a place where we have something common that binds us, and that binds us across racial and religious lines. And my fear is that we are so far from that it may never happen. Because for some who are now learning about the things that we have to address in order to create these common lines, they've already decided they're not going to lean into it. And they're going to ignore it because their standard of living is just okay. It's okay, and it's good enough. So I don't know how we get to a place of having a truly united, states, if we can't be honest about what has gotten us to a place of divisiveness, and be honest about that and truthful about it. Think about our American government right now. When you have to have and debate same-sex marriage laws, and the argument from folks are, well, you can go over to New York and get married and come back here, we'll honor your marriage, as opposed to have you be married right in the state that you live and pay taxes in. That fundamentally makes no sense when we talk about a country that's supposed to be united. The same thing with interracial marriage, the same thing with abortion rights. It goes on and on and on. It just seems to me that we are actually doing the complete opposite of what we should be doing. And we are forcing ourselves, maybe not those of us in this room or virtually listening, but we are forcing ourselves to create and defend lines that are distinct and different from one another. And that is at times crushes my optimism. But I'm hopeful.
We probably have time for one more. Does anyone have a last comment or question? Is everyone good or anything? It seems like our audience is stunned into silence with all of your information. Do you want to say any just last closing remarks or thoughts, Stefano?
Well, the last thing that I did ask, or at least I want to try to challenge the group to do, is to define what they're going to do next. After you read all these books, after you have all the book talks and you have the conversations, and you leave feeling, maybe invigorated or tired. If I was boring, there's never a point where you're going to be faced with a decision to do something or not. And recently, I was on XXI and talking about the shooting in Buffalo that impacted my community where I grew up. And I said at the time that these folks who are creating heinous acts, they at some point, someone at the dinner table or wherever it is has to no longer let drunk Larry be drunk Larry, just to say the most vile and racist and sexist things, and and then get in the car and say, oh, that's just Larry being Larry, or Mike being Mike, or Donald being Donald, right? You have to be able to say in front of your kids and in front of your family exactly what is right for this country, what's in line with your morality and your purpose. If you don't, then you send a message to your kids that you can be complicit and that's okay. And again, that just goes into the same argument that it's okay to ignore it as long as your life's good. And so I think those moments happen more, those moments that where you're tested to make a courageous statement or take a courageous action happens more to white folks than it will ever happen to Black folks. Like we don't like it's almost as if people are very polite, history of niceness to us. They won't say the things they might be thinking because they don't want to offend. But they feel comfortable being offensive around people who they think will just be complicit and not challenge it. I think that's why it happens more in those spaces. So I don't know to what extent people feel courageous to speak up in those moments or not, but I would challenge this group to think about how you will respond next time it happens, right? And I'm not saying you have to lose a brother or sister or just, but I'm saying like, how do you respond for yourself and for the people who are the audience? It's always the audience I'm concerned about. Like the person who's being offensive don't give two cares about the audience. They actually want the audience, right? They don't care how they impact the audience, but they want the audience. And so you have to think about how do you respond in a way that encourages someone in the audience, a child, again, a sibling, a relative, to be courageous when next time they're in that same space. I would also say to you, I would challenge this group from an action standpoint to ask the questions about curriculum that's happening in schools. You all are elected, you all have an ability to vote for board members, and you have a right to ask those questions. Like, what are we doing that's going to make Brighton or Henrietta or Pittsburgh or Greece or the city better tomorrow than it was today? And, again, you don't have to be, picketing outside the school board. Use your political and social agency to do it in ways that make sense for you, but do something. And then lastly, I would say, I'm going to model this on January 25th. So I haven't put it out yet. We're going to have a panel on school transformation. And part one or act one is going to be entitled Stop Studying the Problem. And then in March, I think 22nd, we have the second date, it's going to be Now Act. And it's kind of a call out to the education space to say, like, no more surveys, no more book talks, no more articles. Like, that's all good to build it's all good if it's going to be used to do something. But to sit there and pay someone to come and do a survey about why are kids not performing in school? Like, how many surveys do we need? It's been happening for 10, 20 years, and we know these issues they're not getting better. Surveys aren't making the actions, occur. So what do we do next? So I would ask, the same of you all. If you take it from a stop studying the problem to an action standpoint, what else do you need to know before you move and act? Right? How much more do you need to know before you act? And that's going to be different for everyone. But at least know what that is. So when you get to that point, you're ready to act. And I'm just encouraging individuals to gain knowledge and the effort to do something with it, as opposed to just keep gaining knowledge. And that's my challenge to you, and it's a challenge I've given to myself. And even having this conversation and being as authentic and raw as I was is my effort to act. Because before I would do these talks, I would do the PR tone version of the conversation. I would turn off my computer and go to my next meeting. And I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to have people leaving feeling good. I want people to feel a bit agitated without feeling defeated. Because we also don't have any progress when people who are trying to do the work leave these conversations feeling defeated and hopeless. So agitation is okay. But I don't want anyone to ever leave a talk that I do feeling like they have no responsibility or ability to take action on these matters. So I hope I did that for you today. Again, I thank you for making me read this book. It pushed and challenged me in ways that I didn't anticipate when I first got the title of the book. And I know that my first step in this action phase was to have this conversation with you all. And I'll continue to share what I learned in this book and the title of the book with others in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Shaun, very much, and we wish you safe travel. And I will send Linda, your secretary, the link when you're up on YouTube if you want to share it with anyone.
All right, thank you. Have a great one.
All right, you too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.